This is the Glaze webinar on balancing cost, performance, and quality in February 2024. And the mission of Glaze is to transform greenhouse lighting and systems to support climate smart controlled environment agriculture. So our researchers at Rensselaer Polytech, Cornell University, and Rutgers University research LED lighting systems, as well as the responses of plants to understand how environmental controls can save growers money, as well as reduce energy use and the carbon footprint of greenhouse operations. We're exploring emerging technologies, and we see how those impact different crops, including food crops, floriculture crops, cannabis, and we seek to advance technology transfer with that research. We also educate. So today we're doing our free webinars. We also do short courses and have an upcoming short course I'll tell you about in a second. And we seek to improve the understanding of emerging technologies in the CEA workforce. We also like to see you out and about and connect people across the industry and facilitate networking events, including our annual summit. So without further ado, I'd like to thank our industry advisory board members. They contribute to Glaze to help further our mission and participate in our member meetings, our networking events, and access member benefits, as well as guide us as we seek to perform new research and explore new questions that need to be answered in the CEA space. Our upcoming short course is focused on greenhouse systems. So we're bringing in a few things that we've covered before, but diving into more detail about things like interactive effects. We're going to be talking about supplemental lighting systems like we often do, and controls, but we're also going to be talking about systems such as greenhouse curtains and high performance coverings. So access these insights and join live Q&As with global experts. Starting April 4th through May 9th, it'll be accessible live and on demand. And if you want to check it out, QR codes on the left are for registering, and the one on the right is to find out more information about the course modules. There's also a discounted individual Glaze membership if you would like to participate in Glaze and access member benefits. This webinar is featuring Chris Higgins from Hort Americas, and I'm really excited. I've been really thrilled to think about having this conversation because I've been in the horticultural lighting space for about 5 years, and I've seen a lot of change in just the 5 years I've spent in the space. Chris has been in that space for about 3 times as long, and his company has a really great amount of expertise on how customers are choosing to buy lights and what they're valuing more or less in this current day and age. So we're going to be talking really informally in a conversational way rather than in a lecture sort of format. So I have some prepared questions for Chris that we're going to explore, and we encourage you all to add things in the Q&A as well as in the chat to participate in this discussion. And like I mentioned, we'll reserve some time at the end to address your questions. So I have some pictures as a background to start us off, but I'm actually going to stop sharing the image after a while, and it'll just be Chris and I talking. But these are some images from Hort Americas. I would just like to frame up our discussion by starting with, Chris, what does Hort Americas do in the greenhouse industry?
Yeah, I just realized I need to change my photo that you have of me because I have a lot more white in my beard now than I had when that picture was taken. But what does Hort Americas do? So I think a lot of people see Hort Americas as a distribution company, which that's probably the easiest way to describe us. But the reality is we're really kind of a technically specialized marketing company, meaning most distribution companies carry a very wide assortment of products from a wide assortment of manufacturers. What Hort Americas tries to focus on is a handful of products from manufacturers that we've qualified so that we can provide a high level of technical expertise on those products. And then we can also communicate back to the vendors or the manufacturers as to how we think their products need to change, develop, and advance going into the future so that we can better service the market.
I like to call you a supplier. So in the sort of short term, companies are going to be looking to you to supply you with the technologies you need. They need to accomplish their goals, growing whatever crops they're growing in the environments they're growing them in, right?
Yeah, and we work with we have clients, we have customers that are all throughout the controlled environment, ag, and commercial horticulture space. So we really don't see ourselves specializing in any one crop. It's more or less an environment, right? So whether it's a bedding plant grower that needs to retrofit lights for day length extension so that they can get a flower on a flatter pack before it ships out to a garden center, or it's a cannabis grower, or it's a tomato grower. They're just different crops with different requirements. And our goal is to service each of them with the technical knowledge and know-how to make their crops do what they need to do.
Perfect. So I'm going to stop sharing this image and let's get to talking about you and a bit about your sort of crystal ball about how LED grow lights are being pursued in this, 2024 timeframe. So tell me a bit about yourself and your mission in your work for Hort Americas.
Yeah, a bit about myself. So Hort Americas started in 2008. And one of the reasons I was interested in this space was it really did come to the fact that I was interested in the food side. I was interested in food production in controlled environments. And I was really interested in finding a way in which small and medium-sized farms could be profitable and create the types of jobs and the types of living they wanted to. That interest was supported by my interest in sustainable agriculture, right? So I had those two things that were driving what I was personally interested in back in the mid-2000s. I came from a family farming background. My grandparents were family farmers, and I watched them really struggle in the late 80s and early 90s to adapt to the growing demand for large-scale farming and servicing big box stores and large retail chains at the grocery level. And it was just, I saw controlled environment ag at that time as a way to potentially create good job opportunities for the family farm. Now 15, 16 years later, all of a sudden I've seen that we've shifted away from that, and we now have a lot larger scale farms, in which, again, it's depending on your market, your location, it can be difficult for those small family farms to compete. But I still see, depending on how you build your business, I still see a lot of opportunities for those small and mid-sized farmers.
Well, thanks for telling us a bit about your motivations for being involved in this industry. And so I want to get to some of the topics that we talked about addressing today. So to frame things up, we're going to talk a bit about quality, cost, and performance, but I'm going to dive into sort of the definitions of those. And so the first one we're going to talk about is quality. So as you just mentioned, your 15 to 16 years of sales experience, how do you define quality in horticultural lighting? And what are the determining factors of quality for buyers today? Even if we have a bunch of definitions, what are they kind of defining it at?
So I'm 15 to 16 years of selling for my own company. I have another almost 15 years behind that, 13 years behind that of selling for other people's companies. So I'm at year 28 in roles that have always involved sales and marketing of some sort. I would say I've grown to hate the word quality. Like, anybody who's ever had to be in sales, I don't think anybody ever gets a manager that says that they don't have the best quality product, right? That's just kind of something everybody starts with. And so determining what quality means, I think, is very difficult for a lot of people, especially in an era where we're constantly being hit with different marketing information. Really, what is quality? For me, quality has always meant performance over time, right? Something where there's a standard that I can measure against and determine which products are better than others. But as I've matured in the industry, I've also learned that quality means something different to everybody. And it's become a very subjective term that we don't often have third parties available to validate. So when we look at quality in the lighting industry, it's very easy for us to send a light off and have the spectrum of light measured, right? It's very easy for us to send a light off and have the intensity of light measured at that given point in time. But is that really what quality is? Or is quality something that lasts 10, 15 years at your farm without needing to be replaced? And then how do we prove that as we're launching new products where we don't have, I think the first real commercial LED in horticulture came out in the, 2008, 2009 timeframe commercially. And we don't even have that many years of experience to kind of live up to some of the claims that I've seen being made, as much as 100,000 hour, claims. And if you put that on how many hours a farm normally operates, that's many, many years. And so determining quality for me should be something that's measurable. Many times, I think in the industry right now, we're using quality in a more subjective terms.
Yeah, so I heard you touch on things like quality of light, like spectral treatment, as well as the other definition of quality, such as like longevity of product, or maybe the reputation of the company that is selling you the product, that you're going to be able to count on them being there 7, 10, 15 years later. So one definition of quality can be light quality. And so with LEDs, spectral treatments can vary widely. In even the 5 years that I've been in the industry, I've seen things from blurple to full white to full spectrum, as well as, more scientific terms like red, blue, or white, red, with, the RB and WR used as shortenings for those. So for folks who kind of aren't familiar with all those recipes or flavors, as they sometimes call them now, how does light spectrum affect efficiency, and how are you seeing growers choosing these qualities of light in their application?
I'm going to try to keep that answer straightforward and simple, because it's a very difficult question to answer, because we have so many different geographies that we're installing lights into, and so many different types of structures, right? If we're talking about a greenhouse, we have to remember that electric light is a small percentage of light that the plant's seeing throughout a 24-hour period or throughout a year, right? The goal is you build a greenhouse so that you can use as much sunlight as you possibly can, because you're giving up the ability to truly completely control other variables in the climate. So your goal is to get as much free light as possible. So the contribution of electric light is going to be less than that of sunlight, which is quote unquote full spectrum. However, we have to keep in mind that the glazing on top of the greenhouse will impact the quality of light that comes through. For those that have ever grown, let's say lettuce under a glass greenhouse as an example, and did not have low iron glass, they can see that glass can change how the color of the lettuce colors up in the winter months, right? They might not get enough blues, and it might just be a lighter green instead of a darker red lettuce. And that's due to the glazing. So light is not light. And the structure we put it in determines how big of an impact that light, the color spectrum has on the crop. Now, if we go all the way to the other end of the spectrum and we talk about a vertical farm, or we talk about a cannabis grow that's in a warehouse, now, obviously, because the electric light is providing 100% of the photons that the plant's receiving, you can see more of an impact from that light source than what you would in a greenhouse. And I think this is where we've moved away, the term purple, right? Red and blue only. This is where we've definitely moved away from that, because we have to also keep in mind that in those environments, we are not just growing plants, but we also have people working. So now we have to keep two variables in mind when we're looking at light spectrum. How does the light spectrum implant affect the plants, and how does it affect the people? And so that's the important part to keep it in mind there. Now, I know that there's going to be many people that disagree with this comment that I make, but over the course of the years that we've been selling LEDs as Hort Americas, we've had growers successfully grow crops under red and blue. We've had growers successfully grow crops under white, and we've had growers successfully grow crops under pink. But now we get back to what is quality, and how does that change based on the crop we're growing? I'll give you an example. A lot of people like to stay away from red and blue only lights with high percentages of blue. And by high, I'm going to say something between 15 and 20% blue. Why do they want to stay away from that? Well, that creates a more compact, more dense plant. If you're growing a head of lettuce, and that head of lettuce is compact and dense, that head doesn't open up, and you end up creating situations where you can potentially enhance tip burn, or where you get a rock hard, very tight, compact head of lettuce that doesn't sell very well. Doesn't mean the lettuce dies. It just means it's not sellable. However, you take that same spectrum and you put that spectrum into a young plant production facility where you want to reduce the use of plant growth regulants, and all of a sudden you have a spectrum that is really a perfect fit for that environment. And so, again, the quality of light and the differences between a red blue only and a whole white light are very different and going to be equally as affected by the growing environment that you put them in and the crops that you put under them.
Thanks for that sort of explanation of like light is not light, and the application really matters. And the light
And it's the
spectrum
same in a
effect.
greenhouse. Sorry for interrupting, but it's the same in a greenhouse. If you don't understand the weather patterns around your greenhouse, you'll have the same impact. So if you're in California and you're too close to the ocean and you get the marine layer, well, guess what? Sunlight is not sunlight, right? Sunlight passing through the clouds is different than full-blown sunlight. So it all does come down to where you geographically located at and what structure are you growing in and what crops do you have underneath that structure.
Awesome. So when it comes to the electric light, though, are there still some benefits to using particular spectral treatments because of their energy efficiency aspects? Are growers motivated by that, or is that something that they're sort of like, oh, I'll take that if that happens to be a side benefit?
I think to a degree, what I have seen and what I'm going to say now is really been focused on large scale commercial greenhouses. Because it's my observation that indoor crops like cannabis, where you would have the most lights used, still in those flowering rooms, you have a large dependency on HPS because of the perceived quality that comes out of an HPS lit room versus an LED room. So I'm going to make that as a preference. So if I look at the greenhouses, large scale greenhouses have made more changes in terms of converting from HPS to LED. It appears to me that when we get up around 3 micromoles per joule or 2.7 to 3.2 micromoles per joule, that is about all the industry is willing to pay for. There are going to be clients that want 3.4, 3.5, 3.6 micromoles per joule. Those clients have a tendency to be in an environment where you have a very high cost per kilowatt hour and a long run time. Or they may be highly motivated through some sort of a sustainability initiative or sustainability financial backing. So if you look at those two things, those could sway you one way or another. And if you start to go higher, you end up being a heavy red spectrum, mainly red-blue spectrum. I haven't seen a lot of products that really that are tested that are good to grow plants under that are not red and blue once you get up above that 3.3, 3.4 micromole per joule mark.
Thanks for diving into the efficiency details with me. Of course, something that I always care about as an energy engineer, and I'm always interested to see if that's making the difference. Some utilities are offering, growers incentives for energy savings from light treatments that save energy compared to their HPS baseline. So it's something to explore if you're looking for, incentives, but may not be the reason. Like you said, if you've got longer run times, that might be more important to you than if you have less of a growing season where you're using a lot of supplemental lighting. So let's shift to another parameter of quality, which can be like light intensity you mentioned earlier. So how much light are growers wanting to install in greenhouses in 2024? How have you seen the trends kind of changing?
Yeah, well, if I go through my history in the industry, I think that I've seen the request almost triple in terms of the amount of light that they want to use and this is really over the last 5 to 7 years, as there has been a huge drive to increase yield. It feels like right now as an industry, we have put increased yield over a lot of other metrics. That's kind of a motivator. Sometimes I'm not sure if we're putting that above profit. It feels like we might be. So that might be a loaded statement or a loaded comment. I would say on average in a greenhouse, on average, we start off between 100 and 130 micromoles, and we can climb as high as 400. Now it's going to be very crop dependent and very geography dependent. But if we're talking down here in Texas, we could even go lower, right? We might even go as low as like 80 micromoles, depending on the crop. And then if we go up north, you on a regular basis get the request for 300.
Yeah. And so I appreciate you mentioning that sometimes it seems like increased yields are being pursued at no expense or at no cost effective limit. And so I appreciated a comment you said when we were preparing for this webinar about like think about, do you really need more flowers? Do you really need more heads of lettuce? Do you have a buyer that needs more? Otherwise, it doesn't seem to be the right investment.
Or I think another way you can look at it, again, depending on the structure that you're putting your crop under. And I did say 400 micromoles as a peak. I should clarify, it can go as high as 600 or 800 micromoles if it's cannabis. We just don't get a lot of requests for that in a greenhouse, but it can be that high. Sorry, what was the question that I just moved off of?
Oh, just the question of just, do you feel like people are thinking about whether they need those yields?
So I feel like growers today, especially if they, depending on who their client is, I feel like everybody's trying to push as much yield as they can 12 months a year. I think depending on your crop, maybe we should be asking the question of, okay, does it make more sense for me to maybe build a larger greenhouse that I'm not running at 100% capacity, but I lower my CapEx per square foot or per square meter? And then that gives me a time to maybe cycle out parts of those greenhouse and focus on sanitation, right? Or do I have consistent volume requirements throughout the course of the year? You can look at it two ways. Number one, do consumers consume as much tomatoes and lettuce in December as they do in July? That's a question that you have with the buyers you're working with. Number two, does lettuce and tomatoes have the same value in December that it has in July? And if you get those answers, then I think it becomes a business decision on whether or not you go and put the gas pedal 100% down 12 months a year, or you taper off based on need for your client. But my experience has been that every crop has seasonal demands and every crop has values that fluctuate throughout the course of the year. And it's been very difficult for people to get offtake agreements that are flat throughout the entire year. So I'm just going to make up a number, $1 a pound. I've never seen anybody have a true offtake agreement that is $1 a pound, 12 months a year.
Yeah, and something you said when we were prepping for this as well was like, perhaps don't design for the extremes, design for the, maybe your typical needs, not these highest possible production in your usually slowest months, for example.
And it gets difficult because as individuals who are consulting for you or designing greenhouses or systems for you, we're looking at weather averages, right? And we're saying, okay, well, over the last 20 years, this is what your average temperature was. This is what your average light levels were. And so we're taking those averages. Now, does that mean that you don't have a weather pattern, especially for greenhouse growers, that might be darker than normal 1 month, especially depending on where you're located at and what types of storms you're subjected to? No, it doesn't mean that. But again, let's keep in mind that you might not need to push the crop that hard.
Yep. So we've talked a lot about quality. I wanted to ask, how are growers balancing the capital expense and operating expense of high intensity horticultural lighting with seasonal fluctuations in profitability? I feel like we just answered that question. And so I'm going to go to the next one, which is, there are a lot of metrics to measure performance. What are some ways manufacturers show the performance of lights using light plans? There are some questions in the chat about some parameters, for example. And so are there any standards for light plans and how manufacturers are communicating performance?
Not that I'm aware of in terms of light plans. I think, wow, I've seen a wide variety of light plans cross my desk. I think that many companies really do their best to make the best light plans they can. And then I think other companies that are newer to the space or don't have experience in a lot of different structures might not make light plans that are realistic. So depending on the software that's being used, oftentimes you have to assign values to the structure that you're lighting. Some of those softwares, they kind of assume you're lighting a box, right? And so that impacts how the light is bouncing off when you plug in your IES files. That can make, especially the edges, that can definitely misrepresent what uniformity looks like. And there was a question, what type of uniformity are you looking for? So Horde America's, our goal is always to be above 80% uniformity, right? Now, it's important to know that depending on what country you're getting your light plan from, and right now this is going to go towards the, let's compare myself to the Netherlands. The Dutch have trained their growers to understand light plans differently than what we have done here in the United States. So when you get a light plan out of the Netherlands, a lot of the times the expectation from the supplier is that you as a grower know that you're going to go to the center of the greenhouse and there's going to be a 3x4 meter, square in the center of the greenhouse, in which that's where you're taking your measurements, because everybody knows that in a greenhouse, you're going to have less light on the sides and you're in the center. So when you're checking the performance of the lights, the expectation is that you're going to go to the center of the greenhouse. Well, after many years of selling lights and getting complaints, Horde Americas, we don't do that. We use our uniformity across the entire growing plane in the greenhouse. And we try to provide detailed grids that allow people to look at the edges versus the center. Because especially with this boom we've had in lettuce production, where you really have no walkways and aisleways, it's not always easy to get to the center of the greenhouse, especially if you have a big pond, right? So our expectations is that when we're being checked by our growers, that they're going to have a handheld sensor and they're going to stick their arm or they're going to put that sensor on a post and stand in the center walkway and try to reach under the light as far as they can. So our expectation is that we want to give them data that shows what they should expect to see based on the length of their arm from an aisle walkway.
Yeah, and I appreciate that it's in some ways aligning with best practice from other types of buildings, which is, if you look at IES, it was an acronym that Chris dropped. IES is the Illuminating Engineering Society. It's also the file name extension for things that are uploaded into lighting software. Anyway, those folks have defined uniformity for lighting in spaces all across any types of building types. And so they have standards for uniformity for, gymnasiums, hotels, all types of buildings. And so it's great to hear that in some ways that what you're doing there of making uniformity across the growing plane, that's similar to how it is in other types of buildings. We're not generally walking to the middle of a room and only measuring uniformity there.
Yeah, and we didn't do it by trying to meet a standard. In all honesty, we did it because we had to be able to, from a distance, right? Because our farms are so spread out across the United States, or even for me in Canada, we had to be able to walk a grower through it on the telephone. This is why you're seeing this. This is what you should expect to see. So for me, it's a customer service more than anything, to keep the customers from saying, well, you said I would get this and I don't.
Yeah,
That's what it comes down to.
Keep the customer satisfied. There's a little clarification in the chat of, is that 80% the minimum over the average or the minimum over the max?
That is going to be the minimum over the average.
Thanks for clarifying.
And we do I think Bruno's asking that question. We do put all the data in there. If you ever got a light plan from us, you can just look at page 4 and it will provide min, and max, and average. And then depending on the size of the structure will determine where we can plot the points out. The larger the structure, the further we have to spread the points at, because otherwise it takes so long for the calculation.
Makes sense. Yeah, illuminance plots are something that folks should kind of start to familiarize themselves with. If you haven't taken a look at one from a lighting plan, that's what we've been talking about. So we've been talking about measuring performance, and there is an organization that measures and tests third-party performance of horticultural LEDs, and that's the Design Lights Consortium. And about 5 years ago, they launched their qualified products library, and it's grown to many hundreds, if not a few thousands of products. And so I'm curious, from your experience, are the customers you're working with, or buyers or growers, using this qualified products library? Are they familiar with it? And are they choosing certified lights with tested performance metrics?
My experience is that most of the clients that I've spoken to may have heard of DLC, which is what we all refer to it as. They may have heard of DLC, but they're not necessarily accessing the data on a regular basis. I'm happy to see DLC starting to have more and more requirements, because the early version of DLC it felt like a lot of lights were getting listed, and it felt like a lot of them were being listed based on golden samples, right? So what I mean by golden samples is when you are sending your product to DLC for testing, are you hand making 10 pieces, right? And making sure that those are the best quality stuff, or are you pulling it off of a production line so it is what is going to be representative of a commercial install? That's been my only complaint with working there, is that it's been unclear if how are these really tested? But that through each version of DLC has gotten more and more, there's been more and more requirements, which definitely improves the quality of the data on DLC. Now, as Hort Americas, we use it regularly. Anybody who's applying for utility rebates uses it regularly. And we rely on that as a qualified source of information to both put our products onto, as well as compare what the rest of the industry is doing.
Well, that's good to know that it's being used, and I definitely use it. And especially folks who want rebates, it's sometimes a goal post that has to be passed. It has to be listed, for example. But for example, when I go to the hardware store and buy a new appliance, I might be motivated for the Energy Star label. It doesn't seem yet that growers are caring or looking for that on a third-party certified level for their grow lights yet.
I think the reason why is I personally don't believe we've really, as an industry, activated the retrofit space. I think the majority of the installs that have been done were done either for cannabis, where it was about speed. It wasn't about the rebate. It was about how fast can you send me lights because I'm building out a room and I've got to do it this quick. Or on the greenhouse side, it was new build, right? New build, new build, new build. And many of the rebates didn't really apply to the new build. So I think as we see the industry move towards more of the traditional commercial greenhouses that have existing HPS, my expectation is that's going to be more and more important in qualifying these products for those wide variety of utility rebates.
Absolutely. I see it in my work on my engineering side of my job, where I help growers access rebates, and it's something that retrofits, like you just mentioned, are becoming more often than not how growers are staying competitive, or maybe continuing to maximize production when they've been seeing the effects of climate change, for example. So let's see. What's the average cost of a horticultural LED these days? And how do you measure cost when there's so many variables like crop application, light intensity target, bulk pricing, and others?
Yeah, so the number that I use is dollar per micromole, which ends up coming into, cents per micromole. But that's the number we have a tendency to focus on. And you could, it's very difficult to say what is the average cost because it's so influenced by larger projects where there's volume discounts that are applied. But there's two ways we look at this. High intensity lights have a lower price per micromole than low intensity lights. So if you're building a vertical farm and you have a long linear bar that's less than 100 watts, the price per micromole is going to be higher on that than if you go out and buy a 600, 700, or 1,000 watt LED, where the price per micromole comes down. What we're seeing, I would say the majority of the lights that are being sold are the high output lights. And I'm going to say that today we're somewhere in between the low 20 cents per micromole and the mid 30 cents per micromole. And that's really going to vary a lot based on the fixture. Something we'll talk about here in a few minutes, the warranties, based on all that sorts of things. That's really where you're going to see a big difference.
And so if you see a light that's less than 20 cents per micromole, what might be that an indicator of?
For me, that's an indicator. I almost always know that product's being made in China. And then I start to question, okay, with the current tariffs that we have for importing lighting fixtures from China, there's, depending on, okay, is a tariff included? Or are you as the client going to have to pay that tariff? Because I haven't seen lighting companies that I would consider to deliver quality, back to that crazy word at the beginning of the conversation, deliver quality, which includes a long-term warranty of, let's say, 5 years. I haven't seen those prices really hitting the market at that point with a 5-year warranty from a company that has longevity. I've seen them come again on quotes coming in mainly from Asia, and then it's questionable as to who's going to be paying the tariffs and the duties on that.
Good answers. I appreciate the introduction of a metric here of like dollars per micromole. And so I think it's important to think about that instead of saying something like the average horticultural LED costs $1,000, because that was something that was being said, but it only really applied to high intensity cannabis lights. And that was in a particular time and in even particular regions. So thanks for that discussion. And so we've been talking about a lot of different types of growers. Which types of greenhouse growers in particular do you see being more motivated to upgrade lighting now? Are there categories of growers that are more likely to have quicker payback periods?
Yeah,
Is it?
so it's for me, what I see is runtime, right? I see runtime as being the primary driver. And I'm going to say growers above 2,500 hours a year are more motivated than growers below 2,500 hours a year. If you're a grower below 2,500 hours a year, the motivation usually comes from, okay, I'm a greenhouse that's been in business for decades. I've got HPS lamps that I purchased in the 1990s. I'm only running them 550 to 1,200 hours a year, but my lamps are now starting to fail and I can't get replacement parts. So do I invest in high pressure sodium again, because it's not really affecting my operating expenses because I'm running them for such a short period of time, right? Annual operating expenses. Or do I believe, which if I give my input, I will say yes, or do I believe that HPS will eventually not be available? And now's the time for me to look in investing in equipment that's going to be there, for the long term. And what we're seeing from the larger lighting manufacturers globally is a decreased investment in HPS fixtures. That's not to say that there aren't companies providing good HPS fixtures today. It is to say that legislation is going to continually make it more and more difficult for them to be able to provide the bulbs to the industry. And so please don't anybody take me and say anything against HPS. They have their fit, but that is something that we need to keep in mind as we're investing for the future.
And thanks for saying that sort of magic number of 2,500. I also see that from the utility rebate side, and I see that from even the USDA grants side, where you want to be able to get money for the energy savings. If you don't run the lights as often, you actually have less energy savings, and then you have a longer payback period. It seems counterintuitive, but you have to actually use the light for it to save energy.
Yeah, and to make sense from a capital standpoint, right? Energy efficient equipment that doesn't run is not a great investment.
Yeah. And so thinking about the most cost-effective amount of investment in lighting, and then balancing that with potential investments in other systems that may also save energy or have a longer runtime. So we've got a lot of questions in the chat. I have 2 more questions for you, and then we'll get to those questions in the chat. The second to last question is, when buying lights, what do growers often not prepare themselves for in regards to installation, even now?
Yeah, so Gary just posted that in the chat bar. What growers aren't preparing themselves for, or I don't want to say not preparing, because I think in the back of the mind they know it, but if it's an existing, they're so busy they might not have time to really explore it in detail. So let's focus on a retrofit, because in a retrofit there's more responsibility on the grower to transition the entire system over to prepare for LEDs. Number one, does this new LED light plan I have require me to put additional structure above my crop just to simply mount the lights? Okay, if that is the true, then how am I going to move power to that area? And do I have enough available power to actually light the crop that light based on the manufacturer's calculations? As a company, we have done a significant amount of light plans where we get all the way through the light plan phase. And then we make the mistake of not asking that question, do you have enough power to do this? Rather than starting with how much power do you have available for light, and then figuring out what the right light level is, because it can be expensive to bring more power into the facility. Then looking at the age of the panels, looking at how, if they want to set the lights up where a certain part of the greenhouse is going to be lit at a given point in time, what sort of electrical requirements do we have in terms of creating lighting zones? And then is the light going to communicate with the climate control computer system? What is the age of your climate control computer system? Do you want dimming, which I always recommend if you can put it in to add dimming? Does the climate control computer system that you have allow you to manage dimming? If not, is there a way to put a separate system in that the climate control computer can communicate with this next system, which can communicate to the lights? That is, those are very important parts of the conversation. And then you kind of finish that conversation with who's doing your install. Large companies hire electricians. Smaller companies or more traditional commercial horticulture companies use their maintenance teams. Now we have to look at what are the cables look like coming out of an existing facility if we're doing a retrofit. How are we going to hang the cables? What are the electrical codes for that area in terms of, do the cabling need to be in conduit? What kind of junction boxes do we need to use? Those are things in which you look at the total cost of ownership of these new lights. That can all add up to more than what the lights cost you, depending on the age of your facility and depending on what you currently have installed.
Thanks for covering so much with one answer. You covered things like electrical power capacity service to the space, whether zoning is going to be possible, whether there's ability to hang the lights, how the electrical infrastructure for powering the lights is going to be handled, and if there's code requirements, who's going to be doing the install, and controls, whether there's going to be a system integration or whether there's a potential for a new control system. I just thought I'd plug that control systems can also apply for utility rebates as well in some states. So if you get a lighting upgrade, you might want to explore, is there an incentive for adding controls for the greenhouse? Is there an incentive for adding dimming or daylighting controls, for example? So this is something to think about. It might not be something you are, going to do and invest in otherwise, but it might make some dollars and cents. But I appreciate you mentioning that things like installation costs can cost ultimately more than the fixtures themselves when you account for things like labor and other infrastructure. My last question before we get to the ones in the chat is, to minimize waste, growers should be able to use fixtures for as long as they can, but things like batch issues and component failures can happen. How are growers reacting to these problems, and what customer service should they expect from suppliers?
Good question. Let's start off by saying, know your warranty before you place an order, right? Ask the company for a copy of the warranty that applies to you. There are some companies that have different price levels with different warranties. There are other companies that have different price levels for different qualities. So make sure that you know what you're buying and how that warranty affects you. That's by far and away the most important thing. And then I guess with that warranty, make sure if we just go back over the last 10 years and look at the lighting companies that have been around in horticultural lighting that are no longer there. Make sure that you believe that this warranty is going to have value. If you get a 5-year or a 3-year warranty, make sure you believe that this warranty is going to have value for 3 to 5 years. When it comes to the customer service, the weakest link in an entire lighting system is the power supply or the driver for LEDs. So that's the weakest link, and that's not my opinion. That is what UL tells me on a regular basis, is that is the weakest link. That is likely to be the thing that fails first. So I personally again, go all the way to the back of my first comment was I like sustainability. So I want to have a fixture that is serviceable. I want to have a fixture in which I can replace the power supply if I know that that's the weakest link. And that allows me not to throw away the rest of the unit, because at this point in time, if it's an integrated system, it's kind of like a laptop, right? You have the less expensive laptops, and once they break, there's no way to fix it. And the more expensive ones are kind of serviceable. So it's the same thought process for me with lights. Knowing that that's the weakest link, you would expect that your warranty covers that. It's unlikely that warranty is going to cover labor, but it's going to cover a replacement of the components, and you would hope that you're going to get those replacement parts in days, not weeks or months. Lenses was the other one you asked about. And I think on lenses, the reality is I'm a big fan of lenses. Not all LEDs have lenses on them. So we have to know that we're growing crops in conditions in which we do have humidity. It's important to know that the lights are IP rated. The higher the rating, the better for me, especially depending on the type of production you're doing. Worst case scenario, you're a young plant producer who has lights in a fog room in which the humidity levels will be above 90% and everything's going to be wet. Best case scenario, you're in the middle of the high desert and you're worried about getting humidity in. It's super dry, and then the lights are going to be less impacted by moisture. But definitely pay attention to that. And again, look at the warranty, make sure the entire fixture is serviceable and that you get that warranty that protects you and you can quickly keep your crops lit.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning IP rating. IP stands for ingress protection, and it's something that is required for other lighting fixtures in other important applications like hospitals and places where things need to be wiped down or cleaned often, especially also, like you just mentioned, very humid environments. And so I appreciate you mentioning that like not all ones have lenses, but you might want to consider having lenses if you're going to be applying them in places that are quite humid. And the other thing that reminded me of was boards. Are most light fixtures today on the market not possible to have boards serviced, or are you seeing more fixtures which can have boards serviced?
I only think I know of one company that you can service the boards. I think when we're looking at protecting the ingress protection, right, moisture and dust particles, I think a lot of the potting medias that we're using are making it very difficult to replace those boards and keep that IP rating. I'm not an engineer. That's my
that makes some sense.
I don't want to speak for every manufacturer out there, but that's kind of the way we approach it. And that I think is what's happening with a lot of the other suppliers.
Yeah. Well, thanks for answering my questions. I'm going to jump into the questions in the chat, some of which we might have touched on already a little bit. So I'm going to jump around in there. There was a question in the chat of how do you calculate return on investment? Payback period was something that I used earlier, but do you, with your customers, incorporate into ROI things like operations and maintenance costs or other types of costs?
So, normally we're looking for a 3 to 5 year return on investment with an LED install. Theoretically, an LED shouldn't have any maintenance in those 3 to 5 years, theoretically. When we do a comparison to HPS, we do include labor associated with bulb replacement, right? That's how the best one. Not everybody cleans their reflectors, so that one we kind of leave blank. And so for us, it's a fairly simple calculation where we include run hours, maintenance, depending on the type of fixture, and then cost per kilowatt hour. And then that's how we do it. And then we do the savings. If it's in existing systems, it's a savings versus what's currently hung in that space versus the new install. Obviously, a new install, it's a little bit more difficult to do an ROI calculation.
Yeah, in my work, when we do new installs, we come up with basically a hypothetical high pressure sodium baseline. And sometimes that's accepted by the utilities, but in a business decision, it might not be the right baseline to use. It might be like good to use a lower performance LED as your baseline to compare against and think about like, what is it worth it, this higher efficiency LED?
Yeah. And, I think what we see is before we get to that point in the sales process, normally budget becomes a big issue. And in a new install, it's more or less, hey, here's our lighting budget. We want to get to this or below this. And so then some of those efficacy conversations are taken care of already because you're like, okay, that light automatically moves us out of that conversation. And then we go into more of a medium range efficacy, right? Like somewhere, again, around 3 micromoles per joule.
Yeah, thanks for touching again on that sort of sweet spot of efficacy where at a certain point, more efficient fixtures may not be cost effective for certain types of growers. One of the other questions in the chat was about how optimizing infrastructure, is it better for monocropping to, for example, if you're going to be doing a large install of lighting and you're trying to have a simple install, is it better to have all the same crop, or do you see that growers are doing different infrastructure for different zones based off of however many crops they're using and growing?
So I see growers doing both. My question normally back to my clients or the growers I work closely with is, how sure are you that you're going to have those plants in the same space for the length of these lights? So I come from a floriculture. My younger brother is a floriculture grower. And I know, and having been involved with him in that business, I know that the spacing changes every year, right? The demand for certain crops change, new varieties come to market. And we just kind of treat the whole environment as one. We know we have a high humidity environment for vegetative propagation. We know we have a mother stock environment, and we know we have a young plant environment. And in each one of those, we treat it all the same, so that regardless of what varietals come to us, they can be placed in that environment and do well. I think if we try to maximize performance for one crop, we're almost guaranteed that in 5 years, we're going to be selling a different varietal, right? If we look at how fast new varieties come out, regardless if it's floriculture, tomato production, I don't know enough about the cannabis varietals to know how quickly all of them are changing, because some of them confuse me and they seem to be the same, but they're not really.
Yeah, definitely.
We look at that, and if I even go back within the last 10, 15 years on lettuce production, 15 years ago, and if George Schwartz was on the call or Paul Bettlinger was on the call, they would say, yeah, 15 years ago, we did nothing but head lettuce production and we did nothing but basil. No more than 5, 6, 7 years ago, we moved only to doing teen leaf production, majority, right? All of a sudden, we were all cut leaf. Now that entire environment changed. So should we maximize for that? My goal is to try to choose a more general approach, because your business is going to mature.
It reminds me of the architectural practice of programming, which isn't like software programming, it's like space programming, where you think of all of the possible ways the space might be used, not just today, but in the next 5, 10, 20 years. And you think about having flexible space usage. So going back to our design of like not designing for extremes, that seems to apply here as well, of like, don't design for just that one crop, potentially consider a flexible design that's going to be able to satisfy a variety of crops and hopefully be able to have simple infrastructure at the same time. All right, another question. Some questions are about spectral tuning, which we didn't talk a ton about. Is spectral control really worth it in 2024? Or are people finding it desirable based off of specific crops or geographies?
I'm going to try to answer this one in twofold. I'm not sure. There's a couple of manufacturers out there that might be on this call. I don't know. I didn't. If they're out there, they would have a different answer than I would. If we're in a greenhouse, you're going to be using your lights less than 4,000 hours a year, right? You're going to probably somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 is what you're going to use. If you think about the total amount of hours that the crop is exposed to light, that's not much of the annual use of the lights. My goal would be go efficient, go general, focus on dimming, not tuning, because dimming, there's a direct savings in electricity. So you can run, if you've got 150 micromoles in the greenhouse, but you're in a shoulder season, you only need 75. There is value in that, because that's going to immediately lower your electric bill. Tuning, I'm going to say potentially in a sunless environment where it's 100% electric light, there can be some advantage in that in future proofing your greenhouse. Some of those advantages we have not seen, because the trend has been to add more and more micromoles, right? So as you're adding more and more light, you're kind of taking away some of the advantages of tuning, because you're essentially flooding the plant with the plant with photons, thereby making the impact of spectral differences less seen, assuming you're using the right light to start with and you don't have the wrong spectrum. It again, for me, it's more of a dimming option rather than a tuning option, but I know there's manufacturers that disagree with me.
No, and they're not on the webinar today, so I appreciate your opinions. Especially as an energy efficiency geek, I appreciate that dimming is a way to save energy and is going to potentially have more non-energy benefits as well. There's a question here about code, and I'm curious, you can say whether or not you're happy to answer it, but do you find that like national electric code requirements or things for like GFCI circuits present any issues for projects in greenhouses?
I would say they did not used to, but now it's becoming more and more of an issue. So historically speaking, and a lot of the my friends who have been growing for 10, 20, 30 years knew that they were kind of out in the middle of the country. Nobody paid attention to them. There weren't a ton of permits pulled. And they had a lot of flexibility. What I have seen as investor capital has played more of a role in this space. The facilities are going into more urban areas that are more regulated, or they're going into areas that are closer to industrial parks, or they're getting more publicity. And as that publicity increases, or there's more general GCs that are put on jobs, we're seeing that there's more focus on code. And so yes, today, some of the greenhouses that have been there 10, 20, 30 years, and they know their permitting officials, probably not much of an issue to worry about. But if you're doing a new build and that new build has a GC and it has a turnkey greenhouse provider and it's in a warehouse and it's a grow room, definitely has impact.
Yep, and region by region can vary how much code enforcement, like you mentioned, depends on if the official is aware of the specific requirements of this type of industry as well. They might not be familiar with the differences. I encountered an issue with a code official in Michigan not understanding a greenhouse HVAC system and saying that it wasn't code compliant because they didn't really understand that the piping underground was not plumbing piping, but was HVAC piping. And so just some interesting stuff to think about depending on where you're located. We've got time for one more question. And so I'm going to go back to our earlier questions about spectral treatment. Someone asked in the chat about what are your thoughts on these particular spectrums for strawberries? I kind of want to take it out of the weeds and into a general question. Like, are you finding that there are starting to be silver bullets for particular crops? Like with strawberries, this particular blend is the best. Or is it something that is really, really dependent on a lot of other factors, and you can't say that the lights are going to produce a particular output because there's many other things involved in growing?
So first, to answer your last question first, yes, lights can't fix everything. Lights are not a magic wand that you install and all of a sudden your crop grows great, right? It's just, there are 9 variables that you're trying to manage. Light is one of those variables and is directly related to the other ones. When it comes to light spectrum and something like strawberries, that's actually a really good example. The strawberries would have a special requirement that other crops might not need, and that is the addition of far red. Now, does the addition of far red necessarily increase your yields? No. But does it change the morphology or the structure of the crop, making the crop have a higher quality produce or making it easier to work because it elongates the truss? Yes. Do we today as an industry know what percentage of far red is really needed? Depends on what manufacturer you talk to and depends on what information you read. We're heavily reliant on strawberry research coming out of Belgium. And that would say that, yes, we want far red. The percentage of far red we need isn't that high. I'm talking a couple of percent, maybe 2 to 5% of the total electric light that you're providing it. But the requirement is there for far red. We do see some benefits from far red in other crops as well. There's a couple of research papers out on cucumber production, which shows some benefits. But again, we also have to realize that a lot of the testing facilities that we work with, universities, third-party researchers, they don't necessarily have the equipment that allows them to truly manipulate far red. So sometimes their recommendations are just based on what lights are installed overhead. And so if that fixture had 6% far red, well, it's their responsibility in their paper to put 6% because that's what they tested. But are they saying that 3% would work or 10% wouldn't work? They're not saying that. They're just saying this is what we tested because this is what our budget allowed to install, or this is what we got donated from a lighting manufacturer. So that part for me is, I see the most advantages in far red. I don't see how we're going to add other light spectrum to an LED fixture and keep them cost effective. I know how we can do it. I don't know how we can do it cost effectively.
Thanks for ending on that with me, and for touching on academic research, which is something that Glaze does with our PIs. It's important to remember that academics are testing one condition or maybe a group of conditions, and they often need to have someone else replicate their tests in order for it to be conclusive in any way. So sometimes that sort of conclusion for every crop is not going to be possible, and ranges of treatments may be okay. So thanks so much for your time today, Chris. I really enjoyed our chat, and I appreciate all of the questions from the folks who attended live. And as I mentioned, we'll be putting the recording on YouTube, and I'll be in touch in our newsletter and social media so everyone can find it. And Chris, if you want to drop any information in the chat, please do, so folks can get in touch with you. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, the last that I was going to say, if Gretchen, if you want to, anybody who joined us in the meeting, if you want to send them my contact information or the Hort America's contact information, and if they have questions that we were unable to get to in this chat, I'll do my best to respond, depending on how many I get. I'll do my best to respond to those as quickly as possible, or someone on my team can help me respond, namely Carla Garcia, who's my technical services manager. We'll respond to those questions as quickly as we can if there's things that they would like to direct towards us.
Sounds good. I'll send an email to all the registrants with your email. So thanks for everyone for attending. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks very much, Chris.
Bye-bye.